Hello and welcome back to Quiet Riot, the shiny new show that has rocketed up the charts thanks to all of you, our fabulous listeners. I'm Naomi Smith.
And I'm Andreou. Together we knead the political dough so you can enjoy a delicious pie of current affairs filled with facts and giggles.
Each week, Quiet Riot digests the data, trims the fat and minces the news to bring you a fresh take on the world around us.
We may be based in Britain, but we're not afraid to train our telescopes overseas, if only to remind ourselves that the UK doesn't have a monopoly on political lunacy.
And as ever, we'll have some calls to action to gently encourage you all to engage with civic life and help steer politics into calmer waters.
And we'll do our best to bring competing views together, finding things we can agree on, rather than just shouting at each other. So settle down, turn up the volume, and help us start a quiet riot.
Quiet Riot.
Hello and welcome back to Quiet Riot. I'm Alex.
And I'm Naomi, and on today's show, Conservative election manifesto has been launched. We're going to dig around it, desperately looking for any signs of new ideas, or maybe some properly costed plans, or, I don't know, teensy-weensy bit of basic competence from Team Sunak.
And we pick over the carcass of the European parliamentary elections, look at their impact on players such as Macron and Meloni, and ask whether Britain has missed a trick or dodged a bullet by being outside the Europol.
Plus, and I'm very excited about this, we're going to be talking to investigative journalist extraordinaire and well-renowned author. It's Peter Geoghegan, and we're going to be talking about his pretty disturbing new analysis of the funding links between Liz Truss, Rishi Sunak, and the shadowy money men of Tufton Street.
Hello, Peter, and thank you for joining us today. How are you?
Hello, guys. Thank you so much for having me. I'm delighted to be on the show and to be taking a break from Manifesto Week to talk about other things as well as the manifesto.
Yes. And the first thing I wanted to ask you was about, well, not the manifestos, I guess, but what's been your favorite, almost memorable moment of the campaign so far?
I guess what's been surprising to me, there's been lots of memorable moments which have been, I think, more memorable in infamy than anything else. We had, from Rishi Sunak, the way he announced the election looking like a bird had pooped on his shoulder, to the various, it feels like most of the biggest stories have been kind of Harry Carey stories by different parties, from Reform saying maybe Hitler wasn't all that bad, Labour Party elections. This feels like it's been the story of the election, but I guess the surprise for me, as someone who follows the influence in the campaigns very closely, has been just how poor the Conservative Party campaign has been.
Yes.
They're led by Isaac Levito, who's a renowned strategist. He is, very much grown up at the knee of Linton Crosby, that, notorious in many respects Australian spin doctor. Levito was really seen as having spearheaded Boris Johnson's 2019 campaign. If anyone was going to save the Tory party, Isaac Levito was going to be it. And it feels like whatever the results are on the other side of this election, there's going to be a few Australian political consultants whose fees might not be quite as high as they were before.
I think that's entirely fair, actually. I have been looking at what's unraveled sort of every day, thinking, and this guy's meant to be a genius. I mean, the D-Day stuff is extraordinary. A magic 8-ball would have made a better decision on it.
Yes, it's been quite, I think, on so many levels. If someone had predicted that this would be the kind of tenor of this campaign, and it would be halfway through, and the big question is, will the Tory right try and topple Rishi Sunak? Again, is still the question, even though we're in general election mode. I feel like that says a lot about where this election's been.
I agree. I think there is, as we go to record, the Tory manifesto is out, but there's rumours of a rebellious Tory manifesto to be published by those that don't agree with Sunak and are worried about their fortunes. And it's really hard to know, is that because they are basically pitching their tent for the leadership when it inevitably comes up after the election, or whether they're trying to get Reform UK to back off in their seats because they're genuinely worried they may not even be returned on the 4th of July.
Quiet
But first, it's Alex's favourite feature in the whole wide world, the tongue twister torture that we call the news in 60 seconds, in which we attempt to cram some of the biggest and best stories of the last week into a minute. Now, caution, listeners, this may involve swearing. I'm just going to start the stopwatch.
This is just
you tell me when you're ready.
Degrading for a man of my stature and training.
Hush, hush, you're getting better with every week that goes by.
Okay.
So I'm going to start the clock in 3, 2, 1, you're off.
Rishi Sunak was forced to say sorry after leaving D-Day anniversary events early to record an interview in which he lied about lying.
Trump strategist and human sausage Steve Bannon was ordered to prison in his long-running contempt of Congress case.
In Edinburgh, Taylor Swift played the first of her 17 UK dates, providing a soundtrack for the election. Songs included Cruel Summer, We Are Never Ever Getting Back Together, I Knew You Were Trouble, and The Smallest Man Who Ever Lived.
The European Parliament results were also not as bad as some people had feared and most of the press had hoped.
In France, Emmanuel Macron reacted to the Euro elections by essentially challenging the electorate to a cage fight. As the French say, oh merde.
On Monday, the Lib Dems launched their manifesto. The Scottish Tory leader resigned and Sunak had to deny he'd considered resigning himself, all before lunchtime.
Preparations for the Euro 2024 kickball jamboree ramped up with the arrival of England and Scotland and Germany. Scottish midfielder John McGinn stole the show with his Bavarian dancing, after which he collapsed to the floor, rolled around and demanded a red card for all the German dancing.
Rishi Sunak launched the Conservative election manifesto pledging tax cuts for round flights and a bunch of other stuff he'd disappointed us all with before.
Keir Starmer described Sunak's plans as Jeremy Corbyn-style manifesto, prompting raised eyebrows among some Labour.
Campaign Face announced he was standing against Rishi Sunak in the general election. We don't approve of ridiculous figures mocking our democracy and abusing politics to their own ends, so we hope the count wins.
And the most evil penguin, Feathers McGraw, will return to battle Wallace and Gromit in a new movie this Christmas.
Well, we did it under 2 minutes, but we're well over 1 hour. Oh, dearie me.
We are in a world of increasing threats, Sunak said as he introduced the Conservative Election Manifesto on Tuesday, and we must show our enemies that this country will stand strong with our allies. A brave pitch for someone who last week during D-Day celebrations failed, quite literally, to stand with our allies. But what do we make of the manifesto detail? Naomi, what's jumped out for you so far?
So, I mean, it's the kind of veiled threats about ECHR. So it's not explicit about it, but there is stuff in there that kind of alludes to, we must control our borders. And if we can't, we must look at all possible, avenues to try and take back control. And that just worries me on every level. Because when you look at Winston Churchill and what he was trying to do after the Second World War, bringing a European community together with, of course, other leaders from across Europe, part of what he was saying about bringing peace to our very murderous continent was about the frameworks that can help keep us safe. And, frameworks like the ECHR are incredibly important to that. So I'm kind of worried about that angle and the kind of dog whistle that is for certain voters that may be now more inclined to vote Reform UK. So that was definitely, for me, something. How about you guys?
The big thing that jumped out at me was the finances of it, right? Because it is promising a lot of stuff. It is promising a program that will cost almost twice as much as the Labour program will cost, and they're suggesting that they will fund this by eliminating 18 billion from welfare and 12 billion from tax avoidance. And those seem like very big numbers to me, and they really beg the question, if there were basically 30 billion worth of savings to be made, what have you been doing for the last 14 years? Why are you suggesting that there is that much fat in the system? If Labour had suggested exactly the same thing like 6 months ago, they would have torn them to shreds. They would have gone, you are just making up figures.
But the thing is, I see what you've done there, Alex. You've read this manifesto as if this is a party that may be in government implementing. I'm not worried about the detail becoming reality government policy because, okay, yeah, we've still got 3 weeks to go, but these guys ain't probably going to form the next government. It's, for me, worrying what this is signalling for the kind of Tory party we are going to have in existence when they all fight for that leadership battle once Sunak departs the leadership for Palo Alto or wherever he's going to go. I mean, Peter, like, what if you had to sort of place your bets now on the direction of travel for the party? On the one hand, you could say, well, look, of the seats they may hold on to, if it is going to be as apocalyptic as some of the polls describe, actually the parliamentary party might be slightly more one nation-y. Whereas on the other hand, you've got people saying, no, there is only one direction this party is going to go in after the election, and that is a lurch even further to the right.
Had we had this conversation, I think 2 weeks ago, I was probably one of those people who was in the camp of, it really does depend on who that rump Tory party is. Like, who are these people? Who's left? Some suggest that some of the One Nation Tories are more likely to hold their seats. It depends. Like, who holds their seats could be really important. I feel like the emergence of Nigel Farage has changed that dynamic. The prospect of having Nigel Farage in Parliament, which seems very real, I think has changed that dynamic. Whereas before it would have looked like an internal party, an internal Conservative party, kind of internecine conflict, which we basically had for the guts of 10 years since the Brexit referendum, really. That splitting. But I think the emergence of Farage and the likelihood that he's going to be in Parliament, we saw Suella Braverman in recent days saying she would welcome into the party. That feels like that's going to be one of the big issues for the next Tory party leadership, which, frankly, folks, we're not far away from. You're lucky we're going to get to find out what Tory party members think once again, the most polled selectorate in Christendom.
I thought you were going to say, if we're lucky, we're going to get to find out after the election, because there is a chance we might find out before. Look, I completely take on board the point that this is a nonsense manifesto. They know they're not going to get into power, so they might as well promise the moon and the stars and go for it. But the problem is that journalists will now turn around to Labour and say, even though everyone knows this is a nonsense, and, congratulations to whoever in Labour HQ has labelled this the most expensive panic attack in history, because that is an absolutely inspired comment. So journalists will now turn around and say to Labour, why aren't you cutting those taxes? Will you keep to this economic thing? Can you cut welfare spending by 18 billion? So even though it's a nonsense, it then somehow gets turned into a talking point that Labour feel they have to move towards or justify not moving towards. And on that, I wanted to ask you, Peter, from your position, how do you think the election campaign has been covered by the media so far?
I think it's been a campaign where the media has in some ways struggled, frankly, I think, to try and kind of narrate this campaign in a way that isn't a kind of third level Punch and Judy show. And effectively, I think that's what we've ended up with. And I have sympathy for my colleagues in the press, because you kind of have to play with what's in front of you. But we've ended up with this campaign that really bears so little resemblance to most people's day-to-day experience of living in Britain, the day-to-day experience of what the issues facing the country are. It's been framed in many respects by an incredibly unpopular government that's just coming out with increasingly absurd policies, starting off with the national service and increasing to the point. And I would really like, with this manifesto, the big question is, if there's all these savings to be made, why has the government that's been in power for 14 years not made them? And you've got a press who's having to treat this as a serious contest between two parties who might be in government. And I think we've really, I think they've struggled to we've all struggled to, as the politicians, have to break out of that into a kind of a more deeply existential question about what is the real direction of Britain at this point. Yeah. And I think the fact that the Labour Party understandably have gone into the same thing of, instead of actually everything has to be world leading X and world leading Y, and actually a lot of people in Britain would actually probably, I think, be satisfied with just pretty decent, public services, pretty decent things.
And what about Lib Dem manifesto? Because that came out the day before Conservatives, and I mention it not because I think they are likely to help form government. You never know. But when we look back to 1997, one of the most popular things that Tony Blair and Gordon Brown did, of course, was to make the Bank of England independent. That was not in the Labour 97 manifesto. It was in Paddy Ashdown's Liberal Democrats 97 manifesto. So there can be some hidden gems that the governing party then nicks once they're in. I don't know if either of you had a chance to look at it, but, I think for pro-Europeans, there was a lot to be happy about in that manifesto, essentially saying, look, we're not going to get back into Europe anytime soon, but if we are to within any period of time, then
we'd like to work towards
we've got to work towards it. Lots on directly blaming Brexit for higher food prices and economic stagnation, that we're going to have to align with Europe and make these stepping stones from alignment to single market to then potentially rejoining completely. And they did come out very strongly over the weekend for youth mobility visa scheme with Europe, so an under 30s visa-free travel thing. So what did you guys make of that?
Look, it's an ambitious list of things. I hope personally, because of my background as a carer of an elderly parent, I hope that they can set the tone actually on social care. I think their social care proposals are not only decent, but they are also obviously deeply felt and coming from an authentic place because of Ed Davies' background. And nothing would please me more than a Labour government the other side of an election turning to Ed Davey and saying, we want to make you social care czar or whatever, sort of reaching across party lines and saying, you really do understand this, you really feel passionate about it, do you want to lead it? I don't know the extent to which that is, politically realistic, but I would personally love to see it. And then on the other side, you have the Conservative manifesto. I had a look at the section on health and social care. I mean, social care is barely mentioned. And on health, this really did make me stand up and scream at the clouds, because last election, 2019, they promised 6,000 more doctors, okay? And they failed to deliver that. They actually dropped the target, and it was Sunak that dropped the target a couple of years ago when he was Chancellor. He said it's just not realistic. And the other thing we found was that the NHS struggled to train even the additional 1,000 a year that they were aiming towards. And we've got about 800 doctors at the moment who have no training place and no job, okay? So the NHS is struggling to provide training capacity even for the modest 1,000 doctor a year increase that they've managed. And so what do they do in this manifesto? They turn around and promise 28,000 new doctors. Having failed to deliver 6,000, they turn around and promise 4.5 times that in the same time period.
Yeah.
I don't understand that. I don't understand why they are not torn apart by every single newspaper and every single journalist on stuff like this.
I think it's a really interesting question. I think this is it kind of comes back to what I think we end up doing with manifestos. And I think the manifestoification of elections as well, where we sit down and we all treat these as if they are serious proposals for government. And I would agree. I think Alex is right about the Lib Dems. I think the Lib Dems focus on social care is really important. I think it's probably the most important intervention. And I think that and their focus on water, I think, is quite interesting too, where they've seen areas that align with that thing where people don't feel like this is a world-leading country. They feel like things don't work. And they say, we want something to change here. And I think in focusing on a couple of areas, that's probably a very smart place to be for a party that wants to be the third party. The problem is we then focus on the other two manifestos as if they are actual programs for government. And we understand why this exists. But in the case of the Tories, it's completely fatuous. It's nobody thinks this is a program for government. It's not intended as a program for government. And we end up with this strange thing where we're talking about, will the Tories commit, or will they not, before the election manifesto came out, to leaving the ECHR? Nobody thinks Britain is now going to leave the ECHR because it's not going to have a government that's committed to it. And this is all about a strange selection of, positionings for aspects of the Conservative Party. And what happens then is, instead of having proper conversations about what does governing look like on the other side, and and I think this is part of it. It is a first past the post problem too, because there's no sense in which coalitions have to be built on the back of these things. So where parties are positioning themselves with a coalition expectation, instead you have one party who is going to be in government. It's pretty nailed on at this point. The Labour Party will be in government. What they are talking about are almost certainly going to be the policies of government. Some of these will be interesting what the manifesto looks like, but there's question marks about a lot of them. And instead we end up making all this running around policies that really don't exist. And the national service commitment from the Conservatives was just, I think in some ways it felt like actually them just going, we all know this is a game, so we're just going to play it with these policies that were kind of making it on the move.
But I suppose we will potentially see at least one Reform UK MP, maybe more, and the extent to which that will have some kind of drag on the Labour government, I don't know. And it's the sort of thing I've been mulling over. I'd love to get you guys' view on it. We've got what will be left of the Conservative Party fighting for the leadership, feeling very under pressure because of a Reform UK surge to drag it further to the right. If the MPs amongst themselves can't choose, it goes to the members. And we know that the members of the Conservative Party are even further to the right than many of their current MPs and even the ones that may get re-elected. You're then going to have a larger Liberal Democrat Party who, of course, when they were in opposition to a Labour government in the noughties led by Charles Kennedy, attacked Labour from the left. I don't think that they're going to be able to do that this time, because the kinds of seats they are going to win are going to be Conservative Liberal marginals. They'll be relying very heavily on former Conservative voters lending them their vote, sort of affluent, suburban and shire kind of seats. So I don't see that there's going to be, within Parliament at least, much drag on a Labour government in any direction other than towards the right. And I do think that is concerning.
I guess so, but then again, a Labour government with the sort of majority we might see can resist being dragged in any direction quite effectively, I guess. So that's the flip side. I'm also not sure Reform will win an MP, I know the polls are where they are, and I'm basing this on nothing but instinct. But it feels to me like the beginning of this week was the high watermark for their polling numbers. And from here on in, and we are beginning to see already the start of that, everything begins to unravel, because they will be questioned on policies. They will be questioned on policies outside their one policy, which is we hate foreigners. They will be questioned on health, on education, on the economy. First of all, I can't see them having effective answers. Second of all, I think there is a massive communication dysfunction between Nigel Farage and Richard Tice. It seems to me they just don't talk and coordinate with each other. Farage sort of despises everything that's been put on the website and is meant to be part of their contract because it's not a manifesto, and will just freelance this whole thing and get everyone constantly into trouble. He already started by effectively hinting he'd like a private insurance funded health model, and that he had to come out the next day and go, no, that's not what I meant. So I think they will get into increasing trouble. Candidates that they've chosen and not vetted properly will get into trouble. Their polling numbers, I think, will decline in the weeks to come. I don't know how you two feel about it.
Well, I mean, come on, then. In sort of bringing this section to a close, Peter, I'm going to put you right on the spot. If you were a gambling man, would you be betting that we will see Nigel Farage MP, or that we'll see him lose out once again in a Westminster parliamentary election?
I think the Tories have a pretty poor candidate in Giles Watling, even though fans of Bread in the 80s might like him. So I feel like there's a good chance he's going to take that. I don't think Reform are going to take any other seats. I would echo a lot of what Alex is saying as well, though. I think it's been really striking just how far removed. I did a story on my Substack recently about who was bankrolling Reform. And the long and the short of it is it's Richard Tice. It's basically all loans from Richard Tice's companies to Reform. That's where all the money comes from. Tice I think Farage has basically made Tice look like a bit of an idiot. And Tice, he might stay with that ship for a while, but it does look like it's very much a one-man band now. So
it's a mad relationship, isn't it? It's like some kind of, it would be Stockholm syndrome if you were also paying. It's like a kink. It's like some kind of fetish. I'm going to pay you a lot of money to treat me badly.
Listen, they don't do foreign analogies. It would be Stockton syndrome.
Very good. Okay, well, listeners, we like to give you a call to action, and I'm going to abuse my host privilege this week.
Again.
This is the last show that we are going to record before Best of Britain launches its tactical vote recommendations on the 17th of June at 10 a.m, where we'll be giving advice about how to vote locally in order to change the government nationally, because we do know that in different seats, there is a different party that is best placed to stop the Conservative candidate winning or get rid of the incumbent Conservative MP. So please do go and sign up for alerts at getvoting.org. And that means the second they drop, you'll be alerted to it. It's also quite a handy site for signing up for reminders to take your photo ID with you to the polling station and things like that.
And also really useful resources, and I'll give two very quick examples. I didn't know that women who are effectively escaping domestic abuse situations, actually women and men escaping domestic abuse situations, can sign up to vote anonymously.
Yep.
I had no idea that could happen. And I didn't know that homeless people or people with no fixed address can also sign up to vote. So do visit that site and check out the resources.
Quiet, Riot.
Now it's that time again when we dip our toes into the perilous waters of wokeness. It's time for Wokey Dokey. Pluck them banjos, boys.
Wokey Dokey.
Naomi, it's your turn this week. What have you for us?
Okay, well, this week we're going to trample on the wise words of Express columnist, author, ardent Brexiteer Leo McKinstry. And in particular, listeners, we're going to luxuriate in an Express piece last week in which Leo let rip about woke officials, diversity, Ken Livingstone, identity politics, and, drumroll, the Conservative Party. I mean, everyone copped some flack in this piece, which really is quite remarkable, given that it was only 9 paragraphs long. but the headline itself is this sort of work of absolute rabid genius. It read, "Unaccountable cabal of woke officials is bent on pursuing a radical progressive agenda."
Nice.
Leo notes very sagely that after 14 years of Conservative rule, mass immigration is at a record level, the tax burden at its highest since the 40s, public services mired in crisis, and the welfare system is undermining enterprise and employment. Leo has a little list of things that wind him up. In the next paragraph, he rages on. At times, it feels as if Britain is governed not by a Conservative administration, but by an unaccountable cabal of woke officials bent on imposing a radical progressive agenda where diversity has become orthodoxy and vast sums of taxpayer money are squandered on indoctrination. Immigration, that's because of wokeness. Tax misery, wokeness too. Broken NHS, you guessed it, wokeness. Benefit system on its knees, hello, wokeness, my old friend. So you really kept the feeling that Leo could stub his toe and then rage at the woke skirting board. He's done a little bit of research. He's counted 116 charities involved with the Pride movement. Leo gets really gets his anti-woke knickers in a twist over this and kind of goes on about them running workshops as sex tapes and a discussion where panelists speak about their experience in the world of sex toys and kink.
I feel this is revealing quite a lot that Leo may not have wished to reveal, don't you?
I think so too. Even even the Conservative Party now is too woke.
Thanks, Naomi. Listeners, if you want to be part of the wider woke club, email in any hilarious instances of wokeness to quietriotpod@gmail.com.
Now we're moving on to our next topic with our fantastic guest. Before we do, though, I'm just going to do a brief introduction for any listeners who aren't familiar with a building very near Parliament in SW1, and it's a building at number 55 Tufton Street. In it is housed a lot of organisations that include things like the IEA, the Institute of Economic Affairs, but over the years has been home to Leave Means Leave, Taxpayers Alliance, Legatum Institute, Civitas. Peter will correct me if I've got any of that wrong, and we'll fill in the blanks of the many more that are there. But I just wanted to let listeners know that within this building, a lot of campaigns and organisations exist. They are all kind of, their own kind of companies with notionally, walls of separation between them. But obviously they share an ethos, a set of values, and operate as a kind of libertarian hub, and have been very, very supportive of the careers of people like Liz Truss. So with us today, as you all know, it is the brilliant investigative journalist Peter Geoghegan. And Peter, you really have been drilling down into the detail of the people and the money within these organisations and the crossover with the Conservative Party and Rishi Sunak. You've had a brilliant expose of it land in the media today. Give us the headlines of that.
Thank you so much, Naomi. Thank you so much for having me on. Yeah, and I must say, this is an area I've been so fascinated by for a long time. And I kind of came as somebody who was a bit of an ingenue into covering these issues in British politics. And when I started reporting on money in politics, I went, hang on, who are these think tanks and why are they in the media all the time? Like, who are these people? And like, why, how does this work? And it turns out that they are anonymously funded, which made me very interested. And it turned out that they had a huge amount of reach. And, before I tell you about my latest story, I must say, when I wrote my last book, Democracy for Sale, Dark Money, Dirty Politics, which came out in 2020, I looked at a lot of these think tanks in depth in that. And when I finished that book, a few people said to me, look, I really like the book, but I think you go a bit too far in those think tanks. You're almost conspiratorial about them. And fast forward 2 years, Liz Truss is the Prime Minister and she's completely surrounded herself by people from Tufton Street. And that's what's running the country. And unfortunately, I feel like I was a prophet too early.
And so you've been tracking dark money and opaque funding in the British political system for a long time. But what have you kind of uncovered most recently about the goings on there?
Well, what I've basically discovered was, and this is true looking through things like kind of quite hard to find charity filings, sending freedom of information requests, etc., is that actually Tufton Street itself is. They don't declare its donors, but actually a lot of the money for Tufton Street, for people who are funding Tufton Street, are actually Conservative donors. But more than that, the people who run Tufton Street, the trustees of these organisations, of the Institute of Economic Affairs, of the Centre for Policy Studies, of Policy Exchange, these trustees are almost all Conservative donors. Collectively, they've given more than £35 million to the Conservative Party,
wow,
including more than £5.5 million since Rishi Sunak became Prime Minister.
Wait. So the very people that were funding Liz Truss and that kind of disaster budget that was inflicted on the country, or certainly funding the ideas behind them, that Sunak has tried desperately to distance himself from. I'm the safe pair of hands that is going to get the economy back on its feet. You're saying that he's taken since then how much from these people?
Over £5.5 million from exactly, Naomi, the very people who were behind Liz Truss, and to be in some cases, really not just rhetorically. If you look at somebody like the chairman of the Centre for Policy Studies, which is Lord Michael Spencer, he personally donated £25,000 to Liz Truss. He said that Liz Truss's Prime Minister, her debut at Prime Minister's Questions was, and I quote, the most business-like PMQs that I can remember. He thought she was great. And now he's just said he's going to give £250,000 to Sunak's re-election campaign. You could go on. There's people like Graham Edwards, who also gave £50,000 to Liz Truss's leadership campaign. A couple of months later, Rishi Sunak made him the treasurer of the whole Conservative Party. In the last 18 months, under Rishi Sunak, Graham Edwards has given over £4 million to the Tories. Similarly, Anthony Bamford, Alexander Tamerko, there's loads of names in my stories. And these are what you find with this investigation is a huge amount of the money that's gone into the Conservative Party over the last few years is coming from the very people who run these think tanks on Tufton Street. And they're the same people who were behind Liz Truss, and actually increasingly they're the same people who are behind Rishi Sunak.
Peter, can I ask you something? Do you think the Liz Truss fiasco has had some sort of restraining effect on their swagger, I guess? I sense that some of them are now quite embarrassed by that episode. And, they're very tetchy on social media. Like, if you even mention the mini budget and the fact that they support it, they'll just block you. And it seems to me that there is a campaign to rehabilitate themselves. But where do these people find themselves if in 3 weeks' time we have a Labour government? Do they simply switch to just trying to influence that? Do they swing behind trying to make a Labour's period in power as short as possible? What do you think? Do they morph into?
I think it's a really interesting question. And actually, every single person who I named in my story, I went to at the end of last week, actually asking for a comment on the story. And one of the questions I asked them was, "Are you embarrassed now to have supported Liz Truss? And where's that effect?" And answer there came none. None of the people I went to actually came back to me for a comment. None of these donors actually decided to engage with me on that. But I think it's a very interesting question. I think there's a kind of residual, almost muscle memory for these guys. These are the big Tory donors who almost don't know what to do if they're not putting their hand in their pocket for the Conservative Party. I think it's kind of muscle memory at this stage. I even think these people don't expect them to win. Well, if you look at this, where do these guys go next? They've only really given money to the Tory party, even though these are charities. Most of these think tanks are actually charities, so they actually have a duty to to engage equally with all major political parties. But they've actually given 35 million to the Tories and 0 to Labour, so it doesn't feel all that equal. But I think there's a real question about where these groups go next. And I think as part of this realignment, it's going to be really interesting to see. Brexit totally changed the game for Tufton Street. These guys, the likes of the Centre for Policy Studies, the Institute of Economic Affairs, they'd been really important in the 70s and the 80s under Thatcher. And they'd actually really laid the ground for Thatcherism. Both were really important. The IEA's set up in the 1950s, the CPS under Keith Joseph, super important for kind of providing the ballast for Thatcherism. Under the Labour government, they really didn't know anywhere to go for a very long time. And actually, similarly under Cameron's Conservative government, Brexit, which loads of them supported, really put them back on the map. And they probably got quite used to being back on the map. As I looked at their turnovers, all these organisations have had a huge increase in turnover since Brexit. There's money coming in, the coffers are getting filled. I think it's going to be really interesting to see where the realignment goes. One indication for some of them is if you look at Mark Littlewood, who was the head of the Institute of Economic Affairs for 14 years, very close to Liz Truss, was boasting basically on Twitter about how the IEA had basically incubated Liz Truss.
Yeah.
Very, very, kind of bullish about Liz Truss. He's left the IEA. He now is the head of Liz Truss's Popular Conservatives, which is an organisation that seems to be very happy doing speeches for the Heritage Foundation in the United States, very happy to help Liz Truss go over to CPAC, sit with Steve Bannon, talk about how trans activists in the deep state destroyed her, all of that craziness. So I do think some of these people might end up leaning into the craziness.
And did he get his peerage in the end, Mark Littlewood?
He
did put him forward in head with Solution.
No, he did
and why
not.
do we think that? Was that HOLAC, the House of Lords Appointment Committee, that blocked it, do we think?
Well, HOLAC normally is a bit of a rubber stamp, but in this case it does seem, he did say publicly that it had blocked it. And there had been revelations in the past about, there'd been undercover investigations in which Mark Littlewood was talking about the IEA's access and the access it could give donors. So whether or not that had any bearing on the decision, only HOLAC can tell.
Well, I mean, they have got a lot in common, Mark Littlewood and Liz Truss, because they're both former Liberal Democrats, and he actually was, I think, Director of Communications at the Liberal Democrats in the 2005 general election. So as a former MP said to me once, Naomi, the problem about people who are on a political journey is that they don't stop. And I think we're seeing that played out. Something that I'm really interested in, Peter, is sort of how these groups actually function. And you say that, they've been very well funded since in the run up to and since Brexit. And part of me thinks, okay, well, if they were that well funded while their blend of politics was running the country and had control of Downing Street, how much are they going to pour into them to fight the culture wars and stoke tension and try to claw back power and shorten the time that they are out of influence of number 10? Because when I think about groups like Best for Britain and others that are on the progressive side of civil society, I worry that a new government, Labour-led government, isn't going to have anywhere near as well a funded civil society flanking them on the progressive side as the Tories had when they were in government from the right. So how do these groups actually, how separate are they in reality? How much crossover is there between staff or directors and board members and things like that? And is there potentially actually a lesson for the progressive part of the civil society fabric of the UK to kind of learn from their modus operandi?
They're incredibly interconnected. Like sometimes, I think Tufton Street, not all these groups are based at Tufton Street. There's lots of different addresses, all in the same area. Tufton Street effectively means it's a catch-all title for these different types of groups that all don't declare their donors. And really, we know that they campaign together. I've written stories about that in the past, that they coordinate together. If you look at their list of trustees, it's like a who's who of Conservative Britain. You've got people like Ben Elliott, the former Tory fundraiser at the CPS, Lord Bamford, Lord Spencer, Simon Wolfson. A lot of these people who were very much, as you can hear all the lords, lots of people who are Conservative peers. Lots of people who are big Conservative donors. People who've been Conservative politicians still are. It's a nexus with all of these people connected. I think what they realised a lot, inspired by the US, was having these, what are kind of effectively AstroTurf groups, having loads of different groups, all with different names, makes people feel like they're all different. Whereas in reality, the players really slip between one and the other. I was struck, for example, when I was doing this most recent story, the only people that came back to me with a response to my request for a comment was the Centre for Policy Studies, who said they didn't want to comment. The person who sent the comment, the request, their head of press, was someone whose name I was familiar with because they were at the IEA not too long ago. There's a real revolving door. There's a lot of the special advisors have backgrounds in places like the IEA, and as do a lot of our politicians. Liz Truss being the most obvious example. Rishi Sunak, he used to work for Policy Exchange. He headed up their Black and Ethnic Minority unit.
I didn't know that. That's fascinating.
So it's a real incubator for all this. And in terms of what the progressive side can learn from this, I think my concern, I guess, would be that what you've got from this is a very, very organised set of people. If you strip it away and look about what these organisations are really about fundamentally, what's the one thing that unites all of them? It's tax cuts. The thing that they're always on about is tax cuts. That's the one thing that unites them. What unites lots of the people who give them money? They would like to see tax cuts. It's advantageous to them. And what you ended up with when Liz Truss got into power was that far from these organisations, and with Brexit too, far from these organisations doing what they kind of claim to be doing, which is providing an intellectual ballast, providing something solid, actually it was just flimsy rhetorical nonsense. And as soon as it hit air, it fell apart. And I guess I would be wary of anything that tried to be so coordinated around messages that didn't have, that tried to kind of keep it so tight that it didn't allow for different voices to emerge and for critiques of received wisdom, which is something that really hasn't happened from within Tufton Street.
And I think the other thing it provides them is with sort of media variety. Because you can get, political programs having someone there from the IEA today, and then someone from the Taxpayers Alliance tomorrow, and then someone from the Adam Smith Institute the next day, etc., and on it goes, when actually you're just getting one view via various talking heads, which is shrink the state, cut tax.
Yeah, I think what has always concerned me is that they're not simply influencing Conservative Party strategy and policy and hogging the airwaves. Am I right, Peter, that actually some of them are quite activist within schools, and they send speakers in under the guise of, oh, we'll come in and, fill a half an hour class session talking about, civic duty and responsibility or whatever, but then actually are seeding messages in schools about their agenda that maybe organizations on the other side of the debate.
This has been a large aspect, actually, of what these organizations have done for a long time. The IEA's had a long-running schools magazine, which it used to put on the internet, and I think it stopped after I did a story where I analysed loads of the pieces that were in the IEA's magazine, and they probably didn't like it very much, because you had things like kind of question, basically climate, at the very least, climate skeptic narratives, etc., coming out in their magazine. But what they do have, they've got they have a long-term running kind of intern programs. What they're very good at doing is acting as a conveyor belt, effectively, for young people to kind of enter the political process, and then ferry them from that often into Parliament directly.
Or journalism. I see a whole bunch of them graduating to The Spectator and The Telegraph.
Matt, and GB News now as well, actually. Yeah. And you have seen this. Like, there's been a kind of think tankification or a Tufton Streetification of the right, a certain right of British politics in terms of the media as well. You see these people who go into places like The Telegraph and kind of take this incredibly bullish approach to politics with them, and then it's very much is actually quite an ideas free space. It's kind of dressed up as it isn't, but there is a real lack of ideas within them, and I think that's the big concern, I think, around this as well. It's created a context in which there really isn't. It's not like there's some great debate of ideas going on in the right of British politics. Far from it. And the role that these think tanks plays is actually just about a small number of sectional interests, which you could see from Liz Truss's budget. And it's interesting going back now over what people said when Liz Truss's budget came out. When it came out, it was lauded by the Centre for Policy Studies, who said, and I quote, "It's exactly what we would have hoped for, what people like us have been calling for a long time." This is what the reaction to it was. We all know what happened. It was cataclysmic. The pounds tanked, mortgages soared. It was a disaster, and a political disaster for Britain, both domestically and internationally. Yeah. Liz Truss is that's one motif, I think, a leitmotif of this campaign has been just how toxic Liz Truss is to British voters, which makes the right of the Conservative Party's desire to create something that's more like Liz Truss, electorally all the more concerning.
But that must have been in itself quite an interesting corrective for them, right? They sort of got their wish and it fell apart. So do you sense any introspection at all that sort of looks at that episode and thinks that we should be careful, because if we maneuver ourselves into a position of getting all of this stuff at the same time, it goes horribly wrong?
It does. There's been some aspects of it from some of them, I think. But I don't think, if you listen, there hasn't been much. There's been actually almost no ownership. So Mark Littlewood, who now runs the Popcons with Liz Truss, he has talked before about, he compared Liz Truss's tenure to pizza. If you go out and get a pizza and you have a bad pizza, you don't blame the recipe, you blame the chef. Which in this case is quite a curious thing, giving the chef is Liz Truss.
Yeah, I've heard some kind of, we just didn't warm up the markets to be receptive. If we'd done our homework a little bit better and laid the groundwork, it wouldn't have backfired and it would have all been fine. That's about as much contrition as I've heard. Well, finally, one thing I'd like to ask about, you both mentioned that...
I know you can't, because I've got one too. So
okay, well, I'll do the penultimate, then you can do the last one, Alex. You've both mentioned that the thing that unites the ideology of the funders, the staff, the politicos that are in and around 55 Tufton Street is low tax, small state, low tax, libertarian market fundamentalism. But isn't there also now quite a big move towards stoking culture war, trans inclusivity being something that they don't like and are stoking? To what extent do they really, hate trans people and, are fearful of that LGBT plus agenda? Or is it just a useful wedge issue for them to crack the left open with and bring a few more people over onto their more economic ideology?
I'd almost add a third possibility too, which is where I come down on all this stuff, which is funding. There's American money for these organizations. There has been in the past.
You mean like the religious right and
the religious right and the conservative right in the States, the climate denialist funders in the States. There's big money in the United States for right-wing causes. Often it comes out of what are called donor-assisted funds, which are very opaque, very hard to find out where that money has actually come from in the first place. So effectively, like giant pots of dark money, which then can siphon it off. I've done reporting on this before using corporate filing, using charity filings and corporate filings in the US. It's quite time-consuming and laborious to find things out. I have reported on where British think tanks, Tufton Street think tanks, have got money from the States, and I do think there's a pool of money there. If you look at something like NatCon, the National Conservatism, which some of these groups have actually got very close to, that's well-funded American right money. We're looking, unfortunately, the possibility of Trump becoming the next president of the United States. That again opens up this kind of potential future for some of these organizations. So I do think they're pivoting towards culture war issues. Partly is to do where the Conservative Party are at and how they pushed it. But I do find myself wondering if one of the reasons why you see the likes of Policy Exchange and others having quite avowedly culture wars reports, culture wars units in their organizations is funding as well. If they told us where the money came from, we could find out whether that was true or not, but they don't.
That actually partly covers what I wanted to ask. Is there any sort of safeguard in place to at least know that money isn't coming from foreign regimes directly
into things like think tanks? No, nothing. Nothing, really nothing. We have a lot of these think tanks are charities, so they should be able to be regulated. There is a charity commission that should be able to regulate them. And part of that, they're educational charities, so they're not supposed to be politically partisan. It's very clear that they are politically partisan. And as you can see from the most recent investigation I did, you can see, and my colleague Lucas did, you can see that actually the people who run these are fiercely political. They're Tory donors. They're funding the Tory party, and they're also funding these think tanks. And the Charity Commission really does nothing about this. So I see no real space in which there's any questioning about who's playing the tunes on this. And I think that could become a bit more worrying, actually, under a Labour government, in that a lot of these donors might be less inclined to put their hand in their pocket knowing that it will be. I don't see, knowing that influencing a Labour government through one of these think tanks is going to be more difficult because they're kind of seen as damaged goods. And so people will have to go to possibly more desperate lengths to try and find money.
Peter, we could talk to you forever about this subject and your brilliant deep dive investigative work. I'm sure our listeners will have felt infuriated by what they've heard from you today. Is there anything they can do about it?
Well, one thing you could do is subscribe to our Substack, the Democracy for Sale Substack, to kind of find out more about how dark money and dirty politics is playing out in Britain.
Brilliant. We'll put a link for listeners in the show notes. So if you want more Peter, sign up there. You will not regret it, I promise.
Everyone should want more Peter, I feel.
Thank you very much, Alex. It's very kind.
And now it's time for our third regular feature, Poll the Other One. And Alex, this week, it involves not an opinion poll, but an actual poll, because millions of people went to the polling station last weekend for the European parliamentary elections. You've been poring over the results. Give us your headlines. What's the main takeaway?
So I want to highlight two things, really. The first one is that it's still quite disappointing to see European elections basically being used as proxy contests for domestic issues. And I find it quite surprising that there's been not more action on this. Really, there needs to be a concerted effort to say what you're doing now is electing people to represent you at this level of governance. Because I feel that by them being used as a sort of proxy contest for usually for domestic voters to punish their government for something they don't like, it means that Parliament goes there without a real mandate, without a real story that says the people of Europe want more of this, less of that. Okay?
Yeah.
That's my first point, that it becomes a sort of unintelligible patchwork of what 27 nations think of their domestic government. I don't know what can be done in that area. Maybe it would be good to sort of bust open the party system and say that there will be European parties so that you can vote directly, let's say, for the EPP bloc or for the Socialist and Democrat bloc.
Yeah, go ahead. But I do, if you wouldn't mind, I know our listeners will want to know about Macron's reaction and what your take is on whether it is terrible gamble, great idea.
I mean, it is a terrible gamble and a great idea at the same time. I have tried to game this in my head. Okay, what options did he have given that result in the European election? And it seems to me that option one was to sit there for 3 years while Marine Le Pen claims that he really has no legitimacy, he has no mandate, the country has turned away from him and he's just a squatter. And I think that could be a narrative that lent her a huge amount of kinetic energy for the next presidential election.
And given that he can't run again after the next election, you know what? You might say, well, she can come at him all she likes. It's not going to be him that faces the public at the next presidential election anyway.
Yeah, so the next option was to call the election. Either he wins because effectively he's called the voters' bluff. He's saying to the voters, I suspect you're only voting this because it gets lost in the general pool of the European Parliament and won't really affect your lives directly. But if you were choosing who was going to govern you, you wouldn't choose a far-right party. So that's his gamble, right? He's saying with higher turnout and minds more focused on giving power to the people who actually govern your life, I think you're going to make a different choice. He might be right, he might be wrong. If his party wins that election, then he has completely quashed this notion that Marine Le Pen is sort of on the path to power. He has shown the European parliamentary vote to be what it was, a sort of protest vote. If he loses, then he ends up in a situation because, the president in France is hugely powerful.
Yep.
And we have seen in the past, for example, between Mitterrand and Chirac, where the president can really torment a prime minister. And so he might end up with a parliament, led by Marine Le Pen, probably in coalition with loads of other people, having to get her hands dirty, having to make compromises, having to make deals, and unable to resolve the problems that from the sidelines she claims would be very, very easy for her to solve, and goes into the next election having tested, her claims. So it seems to me that it's a massive gamble, and yet it's what he needed to do. So that's my take. I don't know what you think. Peter, do you have views?
I think it's fascinating, Alex. I'm not a scholar of French politics. I find myself on Twitter. I've stopped more and more putting out my political thoughts on Twitter late on a Sunday night. But I found it really interesting because it felt as if I don't know how much planning there had been around this. It doesn't sound like if there was much, it went beyond Macron himself. But it's really interesting because he has focused attention on this issue in a way that it could have been kind of elided, actually. We could have gone, actually, the centre-right has kept power mainly, and I think he's actually forced a kind of conversation around the far-right in Britain and the far-right elsewhere that, lots of people wanted to avoid. And I think it's become kind of unavoidable because of that. And I think whether it's right or wrong, or whether it succeeds or fails, or whether it was done purely for self-interest or not, that is an important thing to do.
I mean, I find it bold, and I find that it's a move that expresses trust in democracy, actually. Ultimately, whatever the outcome, he's not doing the thing that the Conservatives have done in this country, where a leader falls and then they just replace him with another leader who does terribly and also falls, and then they replace her with another leader that also does terribly. And every poll is saying, we don't like you. Every poll is saying, we want an election, and they ignore it for 2 years. And what Macron's done, at the very least, says, I trust voters. If this is your genuine wish, if you no longer want us in power, go for it.
Well, as the resident polling nerd at Quiet Right, I did have a quick look at the first post-Macron general election announcement French poll, and had to dust off my GCSE French, which I did get an A star in, to try and interpret. And it's looking pretty strong for Le Pen's party on 33%. 23% for the much more left-wing party and about 18% at the moment for Macron's. So we'll see how that plays out over the coming weeks. Of course, the first of their two-stage election happens before the UK general election. So we'll do our best to keep listeners updated as we survey the landscape and see the fallout from that election.
The second point I very quickly wanted to make is that I think if you were an alien that had access to no other information than newspaper headlines, especially in the UK, and you looked at them before and after the election, you would think that Europe is now ruled by fascists. And it's just not true. It is the lowest possible hanging fruit for journalists to reach for that. The far right is marching across Europe. They've been doing it every European election I can remember. And it's simply not the case. The sort of grand coalition of centre-left, centre and centre-right holds an absolute majority in the European Parliament, 55%, only marginally reduced by 1% from what it was before. And then you have players on the edges like Left and the Green voting bloc who will never collaborate with people like the National Front and Alternative for Germany. And so to even consider that other bloc a bloc is a nonsense. And the final point is that far-right parties, they don't form a homogeneous unit. That is also a lie. Looking at the most simple and pertinent issue of the day, the war in Ukraine, Giorgia Meloni is nowhere near where Geert Wilders or Alternative für Deutschland are. So once you break it down into policy areas, there's not even any unity within that radical right bloc. It will be interesting. There will be more deals to be done. There will be more sops to give to blocs like Left and the Greens, which is, I think, a good thing. And it will be an interesting parliament to watch. But if you have been seeing headlines in the Telegraph for the last few days, don't worry. The far right have not taken over Europe.
Poll the Other One will return very, very soon. There is obviously a lot of polling happening at the moment, guys, so we'll only cover the best bits for you, but also listen out for our other occasional feature, Troll With It, where we share some delicious abuse from our quivering inboxes. And that is a wrap. And all that remains is to thank our guest, Peter Geoghegan, for his insight and fantastic digging around on the Tufton Street money. Thank you, Peter.
Thank you so much for having me, guys. I really enjoyed it.
You can follow us on social media at Quiet Riot Pod, or drop us an email with your ideas for future guests and topics to quietriotpod@gmail.com.
And please do remember to like us, rate us, follow us, subscribe to us, post about us, and tell your friends.
Thank you for listening. We'll be back next week.
Quiet Riot. Quiet Riot.
Quiet Riot is an audio production by Cooler Heads, with me, Naomi Smith, Andreou, Kenny Campbell, music by Mariana Sangeeta, artwork by Simona Canelu. Quiet Riot is a co-production with Sandstone Global.
Quiet.
I could do it like you do it by just pretending I'm saying words.
Or do it in Greek.
Just go.
Yeah, if you were doing it in Greek.
No, the whole point is for people to understand.
No, I know, but what I mean, like, it's the whole point. That's why it's funny.